often talk about sightlines in my videos, but I rarely talk about the centerpiece moments of those sightlines. In this case, a castle. I got a comment recently suggesting I do so, and I thought that'd be a great idea. So for this video, I thought I'd go over just some general castle building techniques that I use and some kind of tips and tricks, as well as kind of detail how I built up this castle specifically because I have some old world saves that I can go back and reference in a couple different stages of this actual build. So I thought that'd be fun to go and look at the progress about how I built this one. So the first thing I like to consider when I'm building a new castle or any sort of large centerpiece build is a couple of unique show points within that build itself. So in this Gothic castle here I built, I would say that this whole tower itself is pretty unique and one of the more eye-catching parts of the build. And then probably the start tower over just here. I think those two are the most impressive things about the build. The tower here at the front became more interesting after I built it. Initially, I don't think I meant it to be as much a showpiece as it is, but certainly this circular tower over here was something I had prioritized from the very beginning about being something to attract the eye. So when you're planning out your build initially, choose a couple things either from reference pictures you've seen somebody else's builds that you want to add into your castle, and then you can start with those couple points and then build the rest of the castle around those. Another example of this is in the first castle I built in this world, where we had this really distinct tower way off onto the right, and obviously a pretty unique bridge connecting it. So that clearly from the very beginning when I was planning this out was going to be the major showpiece of this castle. Again, there's a circular tower just a little bit to the left that also is pretty interesting to look at. And then coming from this direction, I have this big square tower here that I think is also visually interesting, more so than the rest of the build. So I'd say those three are kind of like the centerpieces of this big centerpiece as a whole. So when I was planning this out initially, I was planning my sightlines around those three pieces because those are the things I wanted the player to be able to see specifically. And in the castle we'll be focusing on today, I'd say the showpieces are the circular tower on the right and kind of the bridge that attaches towards it. Obviously that's kind of the main sightline I had here. The sightline includes also the tower on the left, so you can kind of include the pair of towers and the bridge that connects them as a showpiece. This tower 2, when I initially built it, I thought it was going to be a little bit more of a showstopper piece, but there's not really any good angles of it because it's on the water. This is kind of the only view of it, and it's kind of hidden behind the trees, so I didn't do a great job of making this piece into a better sightline. Yeah, again, the rest of this isn't necessarily, there isn't a specific part of it that is that interesting. So I'd say this little section here is kind of the only showcase piece of this castle, but it had to have something to start with. And in this case I did start on this side and kind of built the rest of the castle outwards, in the planning stage at least, which we'll see in just a second. Okay, so ideally now that you have a couple ideas in your head about showpieces that you want to add into your build, I start almost always with wool on big builds like this, and I'll plan out those pieces specifically. So in this case, I put the big round tower on this side because I knew I wanted to have something go across this gap here. That's the whole point I put this thing in. Doesn't look supernatural, but it helped make this shape. So all this was just for this little showpiece here. So I started with the tower on the right, and then I put the square tower on the left. And then I decided to do the bridge later on because I wasn't sure how I wanted that to look yet. I started with that, and then I made the rest of the castle. So plot those points out. if you know in advance where your paths are going to go, you can make sure that they're going to be, you're going to have some good viewpoints along them. So I already had this path coming out of the forest, and I knew at some point it was going to turn left here, so this is going to be in prime view. Yeah, so start with those. After that, something that I think a lot of people struggle with, and I know I did for years, was whenever I made a castle, I would put way too many walls, and it would kind of just look like a mess of walls and not very much like a castle. Something I started doing more recently is just putting as few walls as possible in, and I would recommend that too. In this case, I have orange kind of orange representing the walls. In this case, I will have a wall going from this structure over to this tower, and then this one's a bridge, so it doesn't really count, but same sort of idea. The rest of it is all contiguous. Every tower or box leads into the next one. I think it is easier to make a castle look good if you use this strategy rather than putting a bunch of walls everywhere. Yeah, so try and do that. Another tip is to mix up the towers to have them be a mix of squares and circles. And then also change up the sizing. And then if you're going to have a big box, you can put a little tower on the edge like I did with this one. I think I even put a sign here. This little tower will be shorter than the main square. Yeah, and it was. So good job, task me. I followed my directions. Something else to do is plan out your entrance. I don't actually like the entrance to this castle, but I decided early on it was going to be this tower and that it would flow into the rest of the building. It's good to try and have at least one of the boxes be a little bit larger if you want to do a full interior with like actual dining hall, kitchens, throne room, that sort of thing, because the towers don't lend themselves to being super spacious. Even larger ones like this don't give you a ton of room to work with if you want to add like staircases and stuff. That eats up quite a bit of the room. So consider that as well. Something this castle doesn't do is elevation, really. It's all in the same plane, and even more so than that, it's not elevated off the ground very much. Often towers are on tops of hills, which tend to look better. So this is not following that rule at all. But something I'd also recommend is trying to have parts of the castle be lower and parts of them be higher. Even if you were building a castle like on a mountainside and you wanted to have the gatehouse be lower down, you could make it disconnected from the rest of the castle. And that would still add some visual interest by having builds of the same style be on different altitudes. Like I said, this is an exception to that one, but that's another tip that I find being helpful. But there's one thing I want you to take away, is to try and avoid walls if that's something you struggled with in the past. Because as soon as I stopped adding walls everywhere, my castles got a lot better. So this is what the planning looked like after I built up these towers and the rest of the builds. On some of them, I went with full blocks to kind of get a better idea how their design would be fleshed out. In other areas, I felt comfortable enough just with the wireframe about how it was going to look, and then I didn't need to do the work and put in the wool everywhere. But what this did was give me a really good understanding of where I would be able to see which part. For example, this middle tower, I wouldn't be able to see into the actual tower from this angle, but I would be able to see the top of it. And from this angle, it kind of looks like it's just coming out of the top of the roof. And I could decide, okay, is that something I like or is that something I don't like? And again, on this side, I can see, okay, the bridge is going to connect these two, and there's going to be a little sliver of this tower peeking out, but mostly I'm going to get an uninterrupted view of the water, which is something I was looking for. So that was positive, and I knew I could continue with this design. I think in the end, I raised this bridge up to a slightly higher height. Maybe I didn't. I can't remember. Anyway. Yeah, and I also kind of went through with the yellow wool here just so I would know where I needed to add the cliffs, because this is obviously over top of water right now. But yeah, I would recommend doing this, especially if you're going to do a castle or something big like this, so that you can understand what you're going to be able to see and what's going to be hidden behind other parts of your build. Because when you just have the outlines on the ground, it's okay if you're going to do a village, because it doesn't really matter. You can see over top of most of the houses. Yeah, you don't really need to necessarily see how high they're going to go up. But in a castle or monastery or something like that, a lot of the build is going to be hidden from certain angles, and it's best to know what is going to be hidden in advance, so you can decide if you like that or not, and then make changes ahead of time before you put in all the work. So I'd recommend doing something like this. Yeah, and after this stage is choosing out how we're going to make this thing look beautiful. Okay, so unfortunately I didn't have any other intermediary saves between the last one and here. So the castle is more or less done from the outside. But what I wanted to talk about was the colors I chose for the castle. So I structured this one part of the wall so you can kind of see the gradient I used. I wanted white, but I figured having white all the way down might look a bit too much white. So instead, I started from andesite and worked my way up to quartz in the end. To do this, I used, at the time, the new stripped pale oak wood, calcite, which is great, such a lovely block, diorite, which worked pretty well here, and then andesite at the bottom with even some gravel in some areas as a full gradient. You don't need to do a gradient, you could just do a mix of a bunch of different white blocks. Like these two are pretty close together, so you could just kind of do like a 50-50 and kind of go random all the way up in the castle, and it would be mostly fine if you do enough detailing afterwards. As for the roof, I went with the blue design. You can often choose either to work in full blocks on roofs that are this big, like on castles, which is nice because it gives you more blocks to choose from as opposed to being forced into just using stairs like on most houses. In this case, I went with both because they were pretty close in the color palette, so I had even more flexibility than usual. And I went for the blue design. I chose cyan concrete powder and warped block with dark prismarine and warped stairs as the four colors for this blue roof. I always like to try and make the castles as colorful as possible. We got a lot of colorful blocks now, which is nice to red is pretty easy to pull off as well. If you have to use stairs, then your options become a little bit more limited. You could probably use yellow if you want to do bamboo, but with the full blocks, especially if you're going to commit to that, and even on slope section like this, you can really get away with these pretty easily. If you do this all the way across, it still looks really good from below. So you really don't need to use stairs, which is great. It's because it gives you lots of options to work with. Obviously there's lots of different color palettes you could choose. I went with white in this case. You can use darker tones with deep slate. You could use just a generic gray with stone, and andesite and all those sort of blocks. Even like brick, like I did with the chimney, you could use these same 3 blocks I used here, but for the whole castle, for example. With the roofs, obviously any stair block would work, or any of the colorful blocks, because it's a large enough scale where full blocks can be used. When it comes to detailing, here I used basically spruce everywhere, followed by vegetation, but first I went through with spruce. Oftentimes, when you end up with a castle, you get really big sections of walls like this, with not a lot of detailing. I went through here and planned out where I wanted the windows, so they'd all be on at least at a level and on the inside, instead of being all random. So since I've done that, I now know where the windows are in advance, which can help me plan the outside of the build, which is nice. But I think using these kind of wooden bump outs like this, or like over here, for example, are really great ways to kind of take a bland looking wall and make it more interesting. Another way of doing this is using shutters. Obviously lots of different ways to make shutters. You could do a little overhang like this, sort of similar, or a little tray underneath to hold like a little plant or something, or like a window box. Lots of different options here. Those ones are all a little bit closer to the build, whereas the bump outs kind of stick out farther. And I think if you do too much of one or too much of the other, then it may not look the best. So a mix is always ideal. So I start with those ones. And in this case, I believe originally, gotta get the right blocks now, I went with some window boxes below these big main ones. I usually use moss blocks for these, and then probably spruce around the edges. And then under these smaller windows, I'm trying to remember what I did. Might have just been like this or something. And then I believe on the top, I went with this style, which I use everywhere in this world. One trapdoor with a little gate underneath it, which I think works out pretty well. Should probably put something underneath here. And then already from the top perspective, this looks way more filled in. I should probably go through like this as well. That should be here. Yeah, that's probably what I did. So now that I think the top's done, obviously you can put some vegetation here and look a little bit better, but for the most part, that's looking a lot less bland. Now there's this big section down here that I had to work with. I think this is a great case to put in a bump out, which is what I did. If I can find a stair block to borrow for a second, I remember the doorway was here, because that'll be the same way that the windows are. There's already a floor in here. Perfect. Yeah. Okay. So, sticking with the spruce design, I believe I had something kind of like this, and maybe even like that, kind of as a starting point. And then I need trapdoor again. Had kind of going up like this. I think I only had one block kind of in here between the main posts, and it would have been like every 3 probably. So I will time lapse the rest of this. Okay, so that bump out's done. And already this is starting to look a lot more put together as a wall. There's a lot less dead space in here. And since I went with the kind of vegetative look, I would even go through after the fact and put in maybe some glow lichen in this area just to break it up even a little bit further, like I did down here, for example. I'm just going to put in this one last shutter. I think this area here still looks a little bit dull, but I think I remember how I solved that previously, which is by throwing in glowberries here. I'm realizing I didn't do this the same way the first time, so I think went something like this. This is a little bit different. I think the first one was a little bit better, but if I have full blocks, then I can start using the berries and bring them down here, and suddenly that area doesn't look so bare anymore. I'm maybe bring that. Oh, there's already vines there. Cool. All right, so yeah, using some of this help break up that area even further. Other options would be putting in another window here. Yeah, maybe like a little flower box or something. Yeah, something else there to kind of fill it in if you weren't going to go full vegetative like I did here. I think I'm going to do as I mentioned and put some of these throughout here to make it a little bit more interesting. Yeah, okay, that's nice. So yeah, just like that. Obviously got to put some flowers in those flower boxes, but that's how you can take a wall from looking bare to looking more interesting. And back to present day world for the last step, which is really just detailing everything around the castle. It really helps a build stand out if there's stuff around it. Obviously that's extremely time consuming, but if you have the time, I think it's definitely worth it. And then if you have paths throughout your world, then you get nice sight lines like this. So to summarize, start with a couple of showpieces that you know you want to build from the very start, whether that be a tower that has kind of a circular top rather than a pointy one, or maybe a really tall one or something, wherever you want. And then from that, build the rest of your layout, ideally using wool or anything else. And then I would recommend making it 3-dimensional so you can see what towers or what other pieces of your build might disappear behind other pieces that you might not realize until later. And lastly, choose a good color palette for your walls and your roof. There are lots of other good videos out there, people using color theory and stuff. I'm no expert at all, so I'd say just go with the basic gradient or choose a couple blocks that are close together that you like and just use that for the walls. Yeah, and then lastly, spend lots of time detailing. Start with one little area, for example, like this little tower here. Do this one, just a basic little window covering, and then like a little plant here, and then move on to a different part. And you can kind of work your way up to bigger sections like this, because it can definitely get intimidating. But overall, this is how I build large castles and showpieces in my world. So I hope you enjoyed. Leave a like if you liked, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye for now.